Rebecca Martinez had never been one to seek attention. At 32, the quiet botanist from Toronto preferred her greenhouse lab to crowded spaces, her research papers to small talk. But life has a way of forcing us out of our comfort zones. And the phone call that shattered her Tuesday morning was proof of that. "Your father collapsed at his hotel in London," her sister Amanda had sobbed through the phone. "The doctors don't know if he'll make it through the night." Within 4 hours, Rebecca was rushing through Toronto's airport, her hastily packed bag containing little more than a change of clothes and her aviation textbooks. Her unusual hobby of studying aircraft engineering, sparked by childhood dreams of becoming a pilot before her fear of heights took hold, had filled her apartment with technical manuals and vibration analysis charts. She'd planned to read during the long flight to calm her nerves. Flight 447 was packed, mostly business travelers and tourists heading to Dublin with a connection through London. Rebecca squeezed into seat 14A, her hands shaking as she buckled her seatbelt. The woman beside her, an elderly grandmother named Helen, noticed her distress. "First time flying, dear?" Helen asked kindly. "No, just family emergency," Rebecca whispered, her voice catching. As the Boeing 737 climbed through the clouds, Rebecca tried to focus on her breathing exercises. Her father had taught her those during her childhood panic attacks. Count to 4, breathe in, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. But something kept pulling her attention to the window. At first, it was subtle, a slight vibration in the wing that didn't match the steady hum of the engines. Rebecca's trained eye caught what others might dismiss as normal turbulence. She'd spent 3 years working part-time with aeronautical engineers at the University of Toronto, helping analyze stress patterns in aircraft wings. This wasn't right. The flight attendant, a sharp-dressed woman with a name tag reading Jessica, was making her rounds with drinks. Rebecca watched the liquid in passengers' cups, noting how it rippled in an irregular pattern. Her heart began to race, but not from her father's condition this time. "Excuse me," Rebecca called softly as Jessica passed. "I think there might be an issue with the port wing." Jessica paused, her smile professional but strained. "I'm sure everything is fine, Mom. These planes are very safe." "No, you don't understand. I study aircraft vibration patterns. There's something wrong with the— Ma'am, please keep your voice down. You're going to frighten the other passengers." Jessica's tone had shifted from friendly to firm. "I need you to remain calm and seated." Rebecca felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. Around her she could hear whispers starting. A businessman in 15B rolled his eyes and muttered something about nervous flyers to his seatmate. Helen patted Rebecca's arm sympathetically, but even she looked uncertain. What Rebecca didn't know was that Jessica had been having the worst week of her career. 2 flights had been delayed due to passenger complaints about suspicious noises, both of which turned out to be nothing. Her supervisor had specifically warned the crew about entertaining passenger concerns that weren't reported through proper channels. But as Rebecca settled back into her seat, defeated and embarrassed, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The vibration was getting worse, and no one was listening. 20 minutes passed, and the irregular vibration in the wing hadn't stopped. If anything, it was becoming more pronounced. Rebecca pulled out her notebook, a habit from her research days, and began sketching the pattern she was observing. Every few seconds, the wing would shudder in a way that didn't align with normal flight dynamics. Helen leaned over curiously. "What are you drawing, dear?" "The wing movement. See how it's not consistent?" Rebecca pointed toward the window. "In normal flight, there should be steady flex patterns based on air pressure and speed. This is erratic." Helen squinted at the wing, then back at Rebecca's detailed sketches. "You really do know about this stuff, don't you?" Before Rebecca could answer, Jessica reappeared with the drink cart, her expression still cool from their earlier interaction. Behind her walked a taller flight attendant with supervisor stripes on his uniform, Mark Peterson, according to his name tag. "Ma'am, my colleague mentioned you had some concerns about the aircraft," Mark said, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who dealt with anxious passengers countless times. "I want to assure you that all our planes undergo rigorous safety checks before—" "Please, just listen," Rebecca interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "I'm not some paranoid passenger. I have a degree in botanical sciences with a focus on structural analysis, and I've worked with aerospace engineers studying wing stress patterns. What I'm seeing isn't normal turbulence." Mark's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the typical "the plane sounds funny" complaint he usually handled. "What specifically are you observing?" Rebecca showed him her notebook, pointing to the wing. "See the inconsistent vibration frequency? It's not matching the engine rhythm or air pressure changes from altitude. There's a possibility of metal, fatigue, or a developing stress fracture." A few passengers nearby had started paying attention to the conversation. Rebecca could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others annoyed by the disruption to their peaceful flight. "Look, lady," said the businessman from 15B, "some of us are trying to sleep. Can you keep your engineering theories to yourself?" Mark shot him a warning look but turned back to Rebecca with visible skepticism. "Ma'am, I appreciate your expertise, but our pilots have thousands of hours of experience and sophisticated monitoring systems. If there were a real problem, they would know." "But what if they don't know yet?" Rebecca pressed, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "What if the sensors haven't picked it up because it's still in early stages?" Jessica stepped closer to Mark and whispered something in his ear. Rebecca caught fragments. "Been watching the wing for half an hour? Making other passengers nervous? Maybe we should contact the captain." Mark shook his head almost imperceptibly. The last thing they needed was to worry the cockpit over what was likely a nervous passenger's overactive imagination. Airlines had strict protocols about civilian interference with flight operations, especially after several false alarms had cost companies thousands in diverted flights. "I tell you what," Mark said, his tone suggesting he was making a generous concession. "I'll make a note in my report about your concerns. The pilots review all passenger observations after landing." Rebecca's heart sank. After landing might be too late. She looked around the cabin. Helen was watching her with concerned eyes. The businessman had returned to his magazine with obvious irritation, and a young mother across the aisle was nervously adjusting her toddler's seatbelt after overhearing the conversation. As Mark and Jessica moved away, Rebecca heard Jessica mutter, "Probably watched too many disaster movies." The dismissal stung, but what frightened Rebecca more was the growing certainty that she was right. The vibration was subtle enough that passengers might attribute it to normal flight conditions, but her trained eye could see the pattern emerging. She'd seen similar stress signatures in laboratory simulations just months ago. She returned to her notebook, documenting everything with scientific precision. If she was wrong, she'd look foolish, but if she was right and stayed silent, she'd never forgive herself. Outside the window 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, the wing continued its irregular dance against the wind. An hour into the flight, Rebecca's worst fears were beginning to materialize. The wing vibration had developed into what she recognized as a concerning harmonic pattern, the kind that preceded structural failure in the computer simulations she'd helped analyze at the university. She'd tried approaching Mark Peterson twice more, each time being politely but firmly dismissed. The second time, he'd actually warned her about creating a disturbance and suggested she might need to be moved to a different seat if she continued to bother the crew with unfounded concerns. The humiliation burned, but not as much as the growing certainty that everyone on this plane was in danger. Helen had been watching Rebecca's increasingly frantic note-taking with growing concern. "Dear, you're really worried about this, aren't you?" "I am," Rebecca admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been studying these patterns for 3 years. Something is developing with the wing structure, and it's getting worse." "What kind of something?" Rebecca hesitated, not wanting to cause panic. "Possibly a stress fracture. If it progresses, it could lead to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Helen's face paled, but she leaned closer. "What do you need to do?" "I need them to contact the cockpit. The pilots need to know what I'm seeing." Rebecca's hands were shaking now. "But they won't listen. They think I'm just a nervous passenger." That's when they overheard a conversation that changed everything. 2 rows behind them, Mark Peterson was speaking quietly into his phone with someone from the airline's operations center. Rebecca and Helen caught fragments of the conversation that made their blood run cold. Passenger keeps insisting there's a wing problem. No, we've already dismissed it twice. She claims to have some kind of engineering background. Yes, I know about the protocol after that incident last month. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. There had been an incident last month that management didn't want repeated. But what incident? A false alarm that cost money or something worse? Mark continued. Corporate wants us to minimize passenger disruptions unless there's clear evidence of danger. I understand. No, the pilots haven't reported anything unusual. When Mark hung up and walked past their row, Helen grabbed Rebecca's arm. Something's not right about this whole situation. Rebecca nodded grimly. She'd suspected the crew's reluctance went beyond normal procedure. Now it seemed like there were corporate pressures influencing their safety decisions. I have to try one more time, Rebecca said, unbuckling her seatbelt. Wait, Helen said, reaching into her purse. Take this. She handed Rebecca a business card that made her eyes widen. The card read, Helen Richardson, retired FAA safety inspector, 35 years of service. I've been watching you for the past hour, Helen said quietly. Your observations are methodical, your concerns are specific, and your knowledge appears genuine. More importantly, I've been feeling the same irregularities you're documenting. Rebecca felt a surge of validation mixed with terror. If a retired FAA inspector was taking her seriously, they were potentially looking at a real emergency. What do we do? Rebecca asked. Helen's expression hardened with determination. We make them listen. But first, show me exactly what you're seeing. As Rebecca walked Helen through her observations and sketches, neither woman noticed that the young mother across the aisle, a woman named Lisa Chen, who worked as a structural engineer for Boeing, had been quietly listening to every word. The pieces were falling into place, but time was running out. Outside the window, the wing's irregular behavior was becoming more pronounced, and Rebecca's worst fears were about to be realized. The flight crew's refusal to take her seriously wasn't just dismissive, it was potentially catastrophic. Lisa Chen had been trying to sleep, her 2-year-old son finally quiet in her lap, when the repeated conversations about wing problems caught her attention. As a structural engineer who'd spent 5 years working on Boeing's wing stress analysis team before moving to Toronto with her husband, she knew exactly what to listen for. When she heard Rebecca mention harmonic patterns and stress fracture development, Lisa sat up straight. These weren't terms a casual aviation enthusiast would use. This woman knew what she was talking about. During the brief break in conversation between Rebecca and Helen, Lisa unbuckled carefully, settling her sleeping son in his seat, and crossed the aisle. Excuse me, she whispered to Rebecca. I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Lisa, and I'm a structural engineer. I've worked on wing analysis for Boeing. Can you show me what you're seeing? Rebecca's eyes lit up with hope and relief. Finally, someone with credentials who might listen. The vibration pattern started about 90 minutes ago, Rebecca explained, showing Lisa her detailed sketches. It's not matching normal flight dynamics. See these frequency spikes? They're irregular and getting more pronounced. Lisa studied. The notebook then looked out the window. After several minutes of observation, her face grew grave. You're absolutely right. This looks like early-stage harmonic resonance. If it progresses, we could be looking at metal fatigue failure. Helen leaned in. I'm a retired FAA safety inspector. We need to contact the cockpit immediately. Lisa nodded. The crew dismissed you because they're following protocol, but they don't understand what they're looking at. This requires immediate pilot notification. The 3 women formed an unlikely alliance. The botanist with aviation expertise, the retired federal inspector, and the aircraft engineer. Together, they approached Mark Peterson near the galley. Sir, Helen began, showing her FAA identification, I need you to contact the cockpit immediately. We have a potential structural emergency developing. Mark's dismissive expression changed instantly when he saw Helen's credentials. Ma'am, what kind of emergency? Lisa stepped forward. I'm a Boeing structural engineer. We're observing wing vibration patterns consistent with harmonic resonance that could lead to metal fatigue failure. The pilot needs this information now. Additionally, Helen added with authority, Federal Aviation Regulation 121-3/09 requires crew to report any passenger observation of potential structural irregularities, especially when reported by qualified personnel. Mark looked between the three women, his earlier confidence wavering. I need to check with my supervisor. There's no time for checking, Rebecca interjected, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Look at this documentation. The pattern is accelerating. Just then, as if summoned by their conversation, a subtle but noticeable shudder ran through the aircraft. It lasted only a few seconds, but everyone in the immediate area felt it. Lisa grabbed Rebecca's arm. That's not turbulence, that's structural flex. Helen was already moving toward the cockpit area. I'm invoking my federal inspector authority. I need to speak with the captain immediately. Mark looked panicked, caught between corporate protocols and the sudden realization that he might be facing a real emergency. Ma'am, I can't just— You can and you will, Helen said firmly, unless you want to explain to the NTSB why you ignored multiple qualified warnings about a potential structural failure. Jessica appeared from the forward galley, having overheard the commotion. Mark, what's going on? We have 3 passengers claiming there's a wing problem, Mark explained quickly. One's FAA, one's a Boeing engineer, and one's some kind of aviation expert. Another shudder ran through the plane, this one stronger and lasting longer. Several passengers looked up nervously from their books and tablets. Lisa pulled out her own phone, showing Mark her Boeing employee ID. I'm calling this in as a potential safety issue. You can either facilitate communication with the cockpit, or I can file a formal report with the FAA about crew negligence in the face of qualified safety warnings. Rebecca watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and growing dread. Having allies felt incredible, but the fact that they needed to fight so hard to be heard was terrifying. How many other warnings had been dismissed over the years? Mark finally nodded, his face pale. I'll contact the cockpit. But if this turns out to be nothing— If this turns out to be nothing, Helen replied calmly, then we land safely and everyone goes home. If it turns out to be something and we do nothing, we don't. As Mark moved toward the intercom, Rebecca felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. They'd finally gotten through, but now came the real test. Would the pilots take their warning seriously, or would corporate protocols prevail? Even in the cockpit, outside the window, the wing continued its ominous dance against the Atlantic sky. Captain James Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years. In all that time, he'd never received a mid-flight passenger report that made him immediately concerned, until now. Mark Peterson's voice came through the intercom with barely controlled urgency. Captain, we have 3 passengers requesting immediate cockpit communication regarding a potential structural issue with the port wing. One is a retired FAA safety inspector, one is a Boeing structural engineer, and one is an aviation analyst. They're reporting harmonic vibration patterns that they believe indicate developing metal fatigue. Captain Rodriguez exchanged glances with his co-pilot, David Park. They'd felt the subtle irregularities over the past hour, but had attributed them to normal atmospheric conditions over the Atlantic. Their instruments showed all systems normal. Send them up, Rodriguez decided. All 3. This was highly irregular. Civilians were rarely allowed in the cockpit during flight, but the combination of credentials and specific technical language made this more than a typical passenger concern. Minutes later, Rebecca found herself in the cockpit for the first time in her life, flanked by Helen and Lisa. Her legs felt weak, but her mind was razor-sharp. Captain, Helen began, I'm Helen Richardson, retired FAA inspector. These women have been observing and documenting wing behavior that suggests we may have a developing structural issue. Lisa stepped forward with Rebecca's notebook. Captain, I'm Lisa Chen, Boeing structural engineer. The vibration patterns documented here show harmonic resonance characteristics. If this progresses, we could face metal fatigue failure. Captain Rodriguez studied Rebecca's meticulous sketches and notes. The documentation was thorough, technical, and concerning. What's your background? He asked Rebecca directly. I'm Rebecca Martinez. I'm a botanist, but I've worked part-time with aerospace engineers at University of Toronto for 3 years, specifically analyzing wing stress patterns. I've seen this exact pattern in laboratory failure simulations. Co-pilot Park was checking his instruments again. Captain, look at this. The wing stress sensor has been showing intermittent spikes for the past hour. I thought it was atmospheric, but if there's actual structural stress developing, those spikes make sense, Rodriguez finished grimly. Rebecca pulled out a hand-drawn diagram. Captain, I believe we're looking at microfracture development, possibly exacerbated by ice crystal buildup at this altitude. The harmonic resonance is creating a feedback loop that's progressively weakening the wing structure. Rodriguez had seen enough. His instruments might be showing mostly normal readings, but 3 qualified individuals were presenting consistent, technically sound observations that correlated with subtle anomalies they had noticed. David, contact Shannon Control immediately, request emergency landing clearance, and have emergency crews standing by. Captain, Lisa added urgently, if I'm right about the harmonic resonance, you'll want to alter altitude and reduce airspeed. Gradually. Sudden changes could accelerate the failure. Rodriguez nodded, his hands already moving across the controls. Ladies, return to your seats and prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures. And thank you. We'll investigate. This fully on the ground. As they left the cockpit, Rebecca felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. They'd finally been heard, but now the real danger was beginning. Back in the cabin, word was spreading quickly. Some passengers remained calm, but others were beginning to panic as the reality of emergency landing sank in. Helen took charge, with her authoritative presence moving through the cabin and providing calm, factual reassurance. Lisa worked with the flight crew to ensure emergency procedures were properly communicated. Rebecca returned to her seat but found herself unable to sit still. The businessman from 15B, who had earlier dismissed her concerns, approached her. Seat. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. It sounds like you may have saved our lives. Rebecca could only nod, her eyes fixed on the wing outside. The vibration was still there, still growing worse, but now at least everyone knew about it. As the plane began its descent toward Shannon Airport, Rebecca realized that her biggest fear wasn't the potential wing failure, it was what might have happened if she'd stayed silent, if she'd let the crew's dismissal convince her to doubt her own expertise. Sometimes speaking up isn't about being right. Sometimes it's about being willing to be wrong for the chance to save lives. The announcement came over the intercom in Captain Rodriguez's steady voice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Speaking, we are experiencing a minor mechanical issue that requires us to make a precautionary landing in Shannon Island. Emergency crews will be on standby as a safety measure, but this is purely precautionary. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions. What he didn't announce was the growing concern in the cockpit. The wing stress readings were becoming increasingly erratic, and the vibration patterns that Rebecca had documented were now visible to the naked eye. Rebecca watched from her window seat as the wing's movement became more pronounced with each passing minute. The steady flex that should accompany normal flight had become an irregular shudder that made her stomach clench with fear. How bad? Is it? Helen asked quietly, having moved to the empty seat beside Rebecca. Bad, Rebecca whispered. The amplitude is increasing. If the harmonic resonance reaches critical frequency... She didn't finish the sentence. Lisa appeared in the aisle, having just returned from helping the flight crew prepare the cabin. The pilots are dropping altitude slowly to reduce stress on the wing structure. Shannon is about 40 minutes out. Around them, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. Some passengers were praying quietly, others were texting frantically on their phones, and a few were crying softly. The young mother across the aisle was holding her toddler tightly, whispering soothing words that couldn't hide her own terror. Mark Peterson approached their row, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine respect and gratitude. "Ma'am," he said to Rebecca, "the captain asked me to relay his thanks. He also wanted you to know that if you notice any sudden changes in the wing behavior, he needs to know immediately." Rebecca nodded, then noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Mark, I need to speak to the captain again." Right now." The urgency in her voice sent Lisa and Helen into immediate alert. "What is it?" Lisa asked. Rebecca pointed to the wing. "The vibration pattern just changed. It's not harmonic resonance anymore. It's becoming chaotic. That's the pattern, right?" "Before complete structural failure!" Lisa looked out the window and her face went white. "She's right. That's catastrophic pattern development." Helen was already standing. "Mark, get us to the cockpit now. We don't have time for protocol." As they rushed toward the front of the plane, Rebecca's mind was racing through every simulation she'd ever studied. Chaotic vibration meant the metal was reaching its breaking point. At their current altitude and speed, complete wing failure would be unsurvivable. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez took one look at their faces and knew the situation had deteriorated. "What are you seeing?" "The vibration has gone chaotic," Lisa reported. "We're looking at imminent structural failure. Minutes, not hours." Rebecca showed him her latest sketches. "Captain, the pattern indicates the stress fracture has reached critical propagation. Any sudden movement or pressure change could trigger complete failure." Rodriguez was already on the radio to Shannon Control. "Shannon Tower, this is Flight 447. We have confirmed structural emergency. Request immediate clearance for emergency descent and landing. We need every piece of runway you have." "Flight 447, you are cleared for emergency approach. Runway 06 is being cleared. Emergency crews are in position." Co-pilot Park was monitoring the wing stress sensors, which were now showing readings in the red zone. "Captain, we're running out of time." "I know." Rodriguez's voice was calm but tense. "Ladies, I need you to return to the cabin and help prepare for emergency landing. We're going to make this work, but it's going to be rough." As they left the cockpit, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Her warnings had gotten them this far, but now it was up to the pilot's skill and a bit of luck to get everyone down safely. Back in the cabin, Helen took charge of passenger management while Lisa worked with the crew on emergency procedures. Rebecca returned to her seat, but her eyes never left the wing. The vibration was getting worse with each passing minute. She could see metal fatigue lines beginning to appear near the wing root, hairline cracks that were spreading slowly but steadily. As Shannon Airport came into view below, Rebecca realized they were in a race against time. The question wasn't whether they could land safely, it was whether the wing would hold together long enough for them to try. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for emergency landing." Captain Rodriguez's voice carried across the cabin as Flight 447 approached Shannon Airport with emergency vehicles lining the runway like a parade of flashing lights. Rebecca gripped her armrests as she watched the wing outside her window, where the stress fracture lines had become clearly visible, dark spiderweb patterns spreading across the metal surface. "Rebecca," Helen said firmly, "I need you to stop watching the wing. Focus on landing position." But Rebecca couldn't look away. Her scientific mind was cataloging every detail of the structural failure in real time. The chaotic vibration had stabilized into what she recognized as the final stage before catastrophic collapse. The metal was literally tearing itself apart at a molecular level. Lisa leaned across the aisle. "How long do we have?" "I don't know," Rebecca whispered. "The propagation rate is accelerating. It could be seconds or minutes." In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez was fighting to maintain control as the damaged wing created increasingly unstable flight characteristics. Every slight adjustment sent shudders through the aircraft, and the wing stress alarms were now screaming, continuously. "Shannon Tower, Flight 447 on final approach. Be advised we have visible wing damage and expect rough touchdown." "Flight 447, runway is clear, emergency crews standing by. You're cleared to land." Rodriguez looked at his co-pilot. "David, if we lose the wing during touchdown, we're going to ground loop. Be ready to countersteer with everything we've got." "Understood, Captain." Back in the cabin, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Passengers had assumed the brace position, flight attendants were secured in their jump seats, and Rebecca was dividing her attention between the approaching runway and the disintegrating wing structure. "There!" she gasped, pointing at the wing. "The main spar is starting to separate." Lisa saw it too. A gap was opening along the primary structural beam that connected the wing to the fuselage. "That's the critical attachment point. If that fails—" They were less than 100 feet from the runway when Rebecca saw something that made her heart stop. The wingtip was beginning to flutter independently from the rest of the wing structure, a clear sign that the connection was about to fail completely. "It's going to break!" she called out, her voice carrying over the engine noise. At that exact moment, Captain Rodriguez felt the aircraft lurch to the left as the damaged wing began to lose structural integrity. Years of training kicked in as he compensated with opposite rudder and aileron, fighting to keep the plane aligned with the runway. The touchdown was violent. The aircraft hit the runway hard, bounced twice, and immediately pulled left as the damaged wing created massive drag. Rodriguez and Park worked together to maintain control, using every technique they'd learned in emergency training. Rebecca was thrown against the window as the plane skidded sideways down the runway, but her eyes remained fixed on the wing. She watched in horrified fascination as the outer section finally separated completely, tumbling away from the aircraft in a shower of sparks and debris. "Wing separation!" she shouted, though her voice was lost in the chaos of screeching tires and grinding metal. The aircraft continued its sideways slide for what felt like hours but was actually less than 30 seconds. When it finally came to rest, crooked and damaged but intact, the cabin fell silent except for the sound of emergency sirens racing toward them. Rebecca looked around at the other passengers. Many were crying, some were laughing hysterically, and a few were praying. Helen was already unbuckling her seatbelt, falling back into her role as a safety professional. "Everyone remain seated until the crew gives the all-clear," Helen announced with authority. "We're down safe, but we need to follow evacuation procedures." Lisa was staring out the window at the scattered wing debris on the runway. "Rebecca, do you realize what just happened? We lost the wing during landing and survived. That's almost impossible." Rebecca nodded shakily, finally allowing herself to process the magnitude of what they'd just experienced. "If we'd been at cruising altitude when that happened—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. As the evacuation slides deployed and passengers began filing off the aircraft, Rebecca felt a tap on her shoulder. It was the businessman from 15B, the same man who had dismissed her concerns hours earlier. "Ma'am, I just want you to know, you saved my life today. You saved all our lives." Rebecca could only nod, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't wanted to be right. She'd hoped desperately that her fears were unfounded, but sometimes being right about something terrible is the only way to prevent something worse. As she stepped onto Irish soil, Rebecca realized that her quiet life as a botanist had just become something much more complicated. But for now she was simply grateful to be alive, and proud that she'd found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. 3 weeks later, Rebecca sat in her greenhouse laboratory in Toronto, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her plants and research equipment. The peace was interrupted by her phone buzzing with yet another interview request. This time, from CNN, she let it go to voicemail like the dozens of others. The story had exploded across international news. Botanist's aviation knowledge saves 196 lives. The passenger who wouldn't stay silent. How 3 women prevented an aviation disaster. Rebecca had reluctantly given a few interviews, but the attention made her deeply uncomfortable. What she treasured more were the personal messages, letters from passengers thanking her, emails from aviation professionals praising her persistence, and calls from her colleagues expressing pride in her courage. Her father, fully recovered from his collapse in London, had flown to Toronto specifically to tell her how proud he was. But the letter that meant the most arrived that morning, bearing the official seal of the Federal Aviation Administration. "Dear Ms. Martinez, following our investigation into Flight 447, we are writing to formally acknowledge your instrumental role in preventing what could have been a catastrophic aviation accident. Our metallurgical analysis confirmed that the wing's main spar had developed a critical stress fracture that would have resulted in complete structural failure within approximately 6 minutes of when you first reported your concerns. Your persistence, in the face of initial dismissal, combined with your technical knowledge and detailed documentation, directly led to the safe emergency landing of all 196 souls aboard. The flight crew has commended your professionalism and expertise under pressure. We have initiated new training protocols for cabin crew regarding passenger reports of potential safety issues, specifically when reported by individuals with relevant technical backgrounds. Your case will be used as a training example in our safety management courses. The aviation industry is safer because you chose to speak up. Respectfully, Administrator, Federal Aviation Administration Rebecca set the letter down and looked out at her greenhouse where dozens of plant specimens thrived under her careful attention. She'd always believed in the power of quiet observation, of noticing the small changes that others might miss. That skill had served her well in botany, and it had saved lives at 30,000 feet. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Helen Richardson. "Rebecca, dear, I hope you're doing well with all this attention." "It's overwhelming," Rebecca admitted. "I never expected any of this." "Well, I have some news that might interest you. The University of Toronto has contacted me. They want to offer you a position in their new aviation safety research program. Apparently, they're quite impressed with your unique combination of botanical observation skills and aviation knowledge." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering the offer. A month ago, she would have dismissed it immediately. Too much change, too much exposure, too far from her comfortable routine. But something had changed during those terrifying hours over the Atlantic. She'd discovered that her voice, when raised for the right reasons, could make a difference. She'd learned that expertise without courage was worthless, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be ignored. "Tell them I'm interested," she said finally. "Excellent. Oh, and Rebecca," Lisa called earlier, "she's been promoted to Boeing's new passenger safety integration team. Apparently they want engineers who understand the importance of listening to qualified concerns regardless of their source." After hanging up, Rebecca walked outside to her small garden. The late afternoon sun felt warm on her face as she tended to her tomato plants, checking each vine for signs of stress or disease. It was the same careful observation that had served her on Flight 447, the willingness to look closely, to trust her expertise, and to speak up when she saw something wrong. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called over the fence. "Rebecca, I saw you on the news again last night. We're all so proud of you." Rebecca smiled and waved back. She was still the same quiet botanist who preferred plants to crowds, but she'd learned something important about herself. Sometimes the most introverted among us are the ones who notice what others miss, and sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. As evening approached, Rebecca received one final call that day. It was from a young woman named Jennifer, a mechanical engineering student who had read about Flight 447. "Ms. Martinez, I know you're probably tired of talking about this, but I wanted to thank you. I'm studying aerospace engineering, and I've always been afraid to speak up in class when I notice things others don't. Your story made me realize that being quiet isn't always the same as being wrong." Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Jennifer, never doubt your observations. Trust your expertise, document what you see, and don't let anyone dismiss you just because you're young or quiet or different. The world needs people who pay attention." After the call ended, Rebecca sat in her garden as darkness fell, surrounded by the plants she'd nurtured and the quiet life she'd built. She thought about that terrifying flight, about the wing that almost failed, about the passengers who went home to their families because 3 women refused to stay silent. Tomorrow she would call the University of Toronto and accept their offer. She would use her unique skills to help make aviation safer. She would continue to observe, to analyze, and when necessary, to speak up. But tonight she was simply Rebecca Martinez, botanist and gardener, who had learned that sometimes the most important moments in life require us to step outside our comfort zones and find the courage to be heard. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.